You were born in 1840. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking to yourself right now, Mr. Dry, you senile old man. No, I wasn't. Please leave me alone. Well, just for the sake of argument, let's say that you were born in 1840. If you were born in 1840, the world that you were born into would be an agrarian one, where you would be working in agriculture in some way, shape, or form, either as an independent farm owner, a tenant farmer, or, because this is before the 13th Amendment, a slave. But most people were involved in agriculture. You basically organize your life around the sun rather than around the clock. And life in 1840 wasn't all that different from what life was like in 1740 or 1640. And in fact, just as kind of a continuation there, if you wanted to send a message in the 1840s, your speed threshold wasn't the speed of light or the speed of sound, it was the speed of horse. Or in some instances, you could theoretically send a message or people or goods by train or steamship. But remember that that only works in the case of steamships if you live along a coastal area and you can send something to another coastal area. And in the 1840s, remember, you do have trains, but they don't really go anywhere because there hasn't been enough time to establish a railway network. But just think about what life was like by the turn of the century, by the year 1900. By the year 1900, you don't live your life by the sun, you live by the clock. You're no longer your own boss. Instead, you have managers. And in fact, your managers have managers, and they have bosses of their own. And remember that technology has just grown in ways that people can't even begin to understand. Instead of the threshold being the speed of horse, basically communication with the advent of the telegraph and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone virtually moves as fast as the speed of light. Instead of basically your most advanced form of transportation being the horse, which, by the way, hasn't really changed in thousands of years, now we begin to see the advent of the horseless carriage, the first automobile developed by Daimler-Benz in the late 19th century. And as humans begin to master travel on planet Earth, we also begin to take to the skies, of course, with the advent of, a little bit of North Carolina history, the flight of Orville and Wilbur Wright's first aircraft in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, in the early 20th century. The thing is that it looks like life is just changing more rapidly than it ever has in human history. You could argue that there's been more change in the last 60 years than there's been in the last 600. That might be a slight exaggeration, but not much. But if you think about it, even though you see these extraordinary technological advances, people could argue that it hasn't benefited them very much. So, for example, one of the consequences of these changes is the advent of child labor, and the fact that child labor and, of course, female labor, labor that's basically exploiting underrepresented groups that don't have power, is a cornerstone of this era of industrialization. You also have the advent of widespread, depressions in 1873 and 1893, and of course, we've also talked about widespread corruption in our political system. As industrialization makes everything more bureaucratic and organized and complicated, that same principle applies to political organizations, and the result is not a good one. Also, we see Jim Crow spread throughout the South and beyond the South, and in fact, we also see some pushback against other racial groups, especially Chinese immigrants in the West. And of course, women still don't have the right to vote, and their political representation is fairly reduced or fairly minimal. But if you want to see just how different life was for some people in this time period, and how, in some respects, despite all the growth, despite all the change, it seemed like life wasn't getting any better. You have to look at the cities during this time period. Because what's really happening during the Industrial Revolution, especially during the Second Industrial Revolution, is that life is changing dramatically in American cities. So let's assume that you were one of the 28 million immigrants who immigrated to the United States between the years 1880 to 1930. If you were part of that group, odds are you probably arrived through one of the big cities. And of course, sort of the trope is that most immigrants are going to arrive through Ellis Island, right off right in New York City. And it's also important to remember that for most of these immigrants, the idea was that eventually they would be able to go and get their own land, maybe in the West, but that didn't always pan out. Many of them stayed, and of course, because of this wave of immigration, what happens is that these cities become incredibly crowded. If you lived in New York City, you might have to get or rent a tenement house in New York City's 10th Ward. And here the pictures don't really do it justice, actually. In New York City's 10th Ward, there were over 747 people per acre. Pretty crowded, and this is also a time period before deodorant. Also, by the way, the fact that you're, basically putting all these people together, increases the chance of plague and communication of disease, something that we're all too familiar with during this COVID era. And it also means that these small apartment dwellings, tenement houses, were ridiculously crowded. So in New York City, you had roughly 42,700 tenements housing about 1.5 million people. That's around 37 or more people per tenement. And we'll actually see just how crowded these could be. But obviously, because many of these immigrants lacked political power and a political voice, these tenement houses were basically kept in conditions of squalor by landowners. So anyway, if you live in the 10th Ward, things are crowded, things are unsanitary, things are miserable. And then if you look up, if you look over the skyline, you can probably see in the middle of Manhattan the faint outlines of the first skyscrapers in New York City. Skyscrapers like the Woolworth Building. And of course, in Manhattan, you have Wall Street. You have the financial nerve center of the U.S. economy. And so we have like this surreal contrast where some of the poorest Americans are kind of rubbing elbows, maybe not literally, with some of the wealthiest Americans. J.P. Morgan, for example, was a fixture in New York City. So we can see that or let's say that if you're living in the 10th Ward, you're very aware of the fact that things are not going all that well for you. But you're also aware that things are going very well for other people. You begin to see the contrast between the haves and the have-nots. And this is something that's kind of critical in order to understand the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is this pushback against capitalism. And to be honest, it's something that we kind of consider to be a development sort of that follows the Second Industrial Revolution. It's kind of a continuation of that pushback that we talked about that began with labor unions and Midwestern farmers. But really, the most dramatic example of pushback comes from what's happening in the cities and the roots of the progressive movement, which is very complicated. And because the progressive movement isn't like an organization, but its roots are really in here. What's happening in American cities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where it seems like if you're an ordinary person that you can see progress everywhere. People are becoming wealthier. There's, just these extraordinary technological advancements. It seems like everything is getting better and everything is showing signs of progress except where it matters most. except in your ordinary daily life. So, to understand all that first, we have to talk about the birth of American cities. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, but wait, Mr. Dry, cities weren't a thing by this point? I mean, I'm pretty sure that we talked about, like, Philadelphia and New York and Boston, I think, maybe. Good for you, 3AM, for remembering that New York City was a thing during the 1800s. Bravo. So let me be clear what I mean by the birth of cities. I don't mean that cities are invented during the 1800s. What I do mean, though, is that the modern city is really made possible by industrialization. Before industrialization, cities were kind of limited by how much they could reasonably grow. Um, if you want to find a big city before industrialization, the biggest cities in the world usually numbered no more than a few 100,000 people, and that was pushing it, quite frankly. Really big cities. You had like the city of Rome during its apex, which I think numbered above about 1 million people, and that was only by basically shipping buttloads of grain from Egypt to basically keep the urban poor of Rome like non-starving and happy. It was just a lot of work to maintain large city populations. And the thing is that in most cases, it just wasn't worthwhile because there was no reason for large numbers of people to congregate in cities. Generally, cities exist or were, kind of existed because they helped facilitate trade. Or because they were sort of necessary to administer a state, a country, etc. So, in other words, you need to kind of set up administrative centers to help run the government. But generally, if you're looking at the American colonies, remember, Philadelphia was a big city during the 18th century, the second largest in the entire British Empire, and it only numbered around 20,000 people. And of course, Philadelphia, New York City, these cities do get larger during the 18th and early 19th centuries, but not much larger. And the reason is they don't need to get larger. Most people want to go and get their own land, and industrialization isn't yet a thing. But with industrialization, suddenly it actually makes a little more sense to bring large numbers of people into cities so they can work in factories. Because remember that other than raw materials and capital, the only other limiting factor for industrial expansion is large quantities of cheap labor. So this is why cities become a thing during industrialization. And the numbers kind of show, by the way. So, for example, if you're looking at New York City during the year 1860, by 1860, New York City was the largest city in the United States, numbering a little over 1 million people. By the year 1900, in just 40 years' time, that number grows to about 3.5 million people. So like a 3.5 fold increase. But if you look at cities in the Midwest, for example, it's even more extraordinary. Chicago grows 16-fold between the year 1860 to 1900. And actually, if you go back to around the year 1830, it shows something even more extraordinary. I think you might have remember that when we were talking about the Transcontinental Railroad, that Chicago was, supposed to be a hub for the Transcontinental Railroad. And Chicago itself was only founded in around the year 1836 or so, and it was supposed to be kind of this small sort of fortified trading post along the Great Lakes. So Chicago, when it's founded, has a population of only around 300 people. And by the year 1860, that grows to around 109,000 people. And then finally, in 1900, you have 1.7 million people. So you go from 300 people in 1836 to around 1.7 million people by 1900. By the way, the city of Meisenheimer is bigger than Chicago in the 1830s. So just imagine Meisenheimer, as pathetic as it sounds, growing to the size of a city like Chicago during one lifetime, during just your lifetime. And you get an idea of just how extraordinary that can be. And by the way, that is despite the fact that the entire city of Chicago was destroyed in the middle of that process. In 1871, Chicago grows so quickly that, and by the way, this growth is entirely uncontrolled, that there's a fire that breaks out, which basically wipes out at least half of the city. Supposedly, according to myth, that fire is set off by Bessie the cow, who kicks over like a lantern, and that sort of sets up a conflagration that consumes half the city. But it doesn't really affect Chicago's growth very much. I mean, if you kind of look, it just keeps on. I mean, by the year 1900, remember, it gets to a population of 1.7 million people. And that growth doesn't even change really until around the end of the Second World War, thereabouts. The population of Chicago increases 64% in about 9 years. The second industrial revolution is not just an industrial revolution, it's an urban revolution. For the first time in human history, we can point to examples of societies, whether in the United States or the United Kingdom or in Germany, where most people are no longer living in the countryside, living on farms. They're living in cities. Roughly 11 million people migrate from rural to urban areas between the years 1870 to 1920. And by 1920, more Americans will live in cities than on farms. And by the way, a lot of that growth is accelerated by immigration that we've talked about. And again, industrial technology and developments has allowed for cities to actually grow to this size. I mean, before the Industrial Revolution, cities were kind of limited to the extent that they could grow. Before the time period where you had, working sort of city sewage systems, before you had skyscrapers that allowed cities to grow up rather than out, before you had the development of railway systems so that you could have actual public transportation, cities were really cramped, messy, and they weren't very fun places to be. I'm not saying that they get much better during the Industrial Revolution, but at the very least, the extent to which cities can grow, or let's say the ceiling that cities had to grow, increases quite a bit. And by the way, I do have to go ahead and point this out. If you're looking at the growth of cities during this time period, I point out Chicago as a major sort of example, but Chicago doesn't even lead the way. Between 1890 to 1920, you see the city of Detroit increase by 754%. Los Angeles increases by 1,000%, though admittedly it's starting from kind of a lower starting point, admittedly. But events like the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 or the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 demonstrates just how dangerous life in the cities could be, and also just how unplanned this growth really was. Remember that when we talked about Philadelphia, that Philadelphia is one of the rare examples of a city that was planned in advance. Urban planning wasn't really a thing in the early 18th century and hadn't really matured very much by the 19th century. And also because of, this industrialization that's happening, urban planning and construction just can't keep pace with the growth. There's a great reason, by the way, why there's so much, economic and political corruption in construction companies during this time period, and that is because there was a lot of business in construction during this time period. Case in point, just think of the rebuilding of Chicago. But again, you have large quantities of houses that and in buildings that aren't built to any degree of, to any standard. And again, it's growth that is, entirely improvised. And to a certain extent, it's this same problem that leads to the development of tenement houses, where we see that cities are just kind of grappling with what to do as the population increases so dramatically. So all of these problems lead to the development of what we call the progressive movement. Now, we've talked about other sort of movements that are pushing back against this wave of capitalism that spreads in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We talked about labor unions. We talked about political parties in the Midwest that advocate for farmers, like the Populist Party, like the Greenback Party, and the Farmers Alliance. The progressive movement is a little bit different, though. The progressive movement was mainly concerned with poorer Americans, for Americans from immigrant backgrounds, but progressives usually didn't come from that background themselves. Progressives were usually white, middle to upper middle class individuals, usually very highly educated, and they also tended to kind of come from what we would call old money. There's a fascinating argument, by the way, that says that the progressives resist capitalism and the robber barons because ultimately they're the people who get hurt by the robber barons quite a bit. I don't want to say the most, but maybe you could at least say that they get hurt by the robber barons most dramatically. We'll talk about a journalist, Ida Tarbell, who basically goes after Standard Oil. And we'll actually talk about how successful she was in doing so. But Ida Tarbell goes after Standard Oil because her father was the owner of an oil refinery who gets bought out by Standard Oil, and he's basically, destitute as a consequence. And so you could kind of argue that with the progressive movement, even though progressives are concerned over the plight of the poor, over the conditions of cities, you could also kind of make the argument that many progressives have an axe to grind against the robber barons. But anyway, the progressive movement, however, is different than progressivism. And progressivism is a term that gets used a lot today. Usually when it's used today, it's used to describe certain politicians or groups of politicians, whether you're talking about the Squad or Bernie Sanders. Progressives are generally seen to be politicians that sort of advocate for radical changes or reform in some way, more than, let's say, mainstream parties that maybe want sort of moderate reforms. The progressive movement, though, is a little bit different because the progressive movement is pursuing, let's say, very specific changes. And we'll talk about those over the next, for this lecture and the next lecture. But the progressives during this time period aren't yet a political party. They will eventually become a political party, but right now they're not so much politicians as much as journalists. And in fact, really, the progressive movement, its start gets the progressive movement as a whole gets its start from a particular type of journalist called the muckraker. The muckraker is a journalist who is usually trying to expose corruption of businesses or government to the public. And you're probably thinking, well, what's wrong with that? Muckraker doesn't really sound like a compliment, and to a certain extent it's not. But the muckraker is a type of journalist who not only is trying to expose those issues to the public, they usually do so in kind of a sensationalist way, one that is supposed to kind of tug at just as much on the heartstrings as much as on your, sense of rationality and logic. We will discuss many of the muckrakers, and my suggestion is that you be familiar with them. You'll talk about, or we'll discuss Ida Tarbell, we'll discuss Lincoln Steffens, Jacob Riis, and many of the individuals we've already talked about during this time period are arguably muckrakers. Helen Hunt Jackson's A Century of Dishonor is kind of an example of muckraking, because really all that muckraking means is that it's advocacy journalism. You're not reporting on a topic with the supposition that you're supposed to be impartial. And the idea that journalism is supposed to be impartial anyway is kind of a modern idea. Muckraking is one of those, is something where the journalist, or we could even say the writer, because sometimes historians, for example, sort of lateraled into muckraking, where the goal of the author, the objective and the bias of the author is like crystal clear. You can practically see it from orbit. And to some extent, it can be sensationalist by design to motivate and sort of change public opinion. Probably the best example of this, and arguably one of the first examples of muckraking, is Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, published in 1890. Now, How the Other Half Lives is, if you look at the excerpt that you guys have to source, I mean, it's technically a book, but that doesn't really do it justice, because the appeal or the focus was less on the book and more on the other parts of the work. Because Jacob Riis was actually an immigrant from Denmark who actually immigrates to the United States after, a long and tumultuous breakup. And he's so heartbroken because the girl he loves turns down his proposal that he only finds solace, traveling to some faraway distant country. So he decides to immigrate to the United States. Once he gets there, though, what he finds shocks him. Instead of very easily being able to find a job and get a place to live, in fact, Jacob Riis is impoverished for his first few years in the United States. He's forced to actually sort of sleep outside in the open street. He also eats scraps tossed out by some of the most posh restaurants in New York City. Delmonico's is one that comes to mind. And apparently while he's sleeping, his most prized possession, a locket with his ex-flame's strand of hair in it, is stolen. And then he decides to go and complain to an officer about it. And apparently at this point, the only friend that Riis has is a little stray dog. Well, when he complains to the police officer, not only does the police officer just kind of give him the cold shoulder, but apparently there's like a fight that kind of breaks out between Riis and the police officer. Well, apparently the dog comes to Riis's defense. And what happens is that, trigger warning, the police officer shoots the dog. And Riis is absolutely heartbroken because his one companion in the New World is killed by supposedly one of the protectors of law and order in New York City. So this sort of kind of lights a flame in Riis. Not a flame for his ex-girlfriend, but instead a flame to get some justice. And by the way, when Riis does get famous, apparently one of the things that satisfies him the most is the fact that he gets the police officer reprimanded and maybe even fired. I can't remember. But this also is kind of something we see with a lot of progressives themselves, is that a lot of the reasons they embrace progressive reform is because of, a very sort of tumultuous past of personal reasons, right? Now, with Riis, even though this is all happening in the 1870s, he never forgets that early experience in the United States. And so what happens is that eventually he goes to work with a newspaper in New York City, gets a detective camera, and goes around and chronicles the plight of the city's urban poor in neighborhoods like the East Side, which had, again, become like one of the most crowded, actually the most crowded place on planet Earth. So What Rees would do is he would just kind of go around and start taking pictures of conditions in these tenement houses. And as you can kind of see, you don't have any indoor plumbing. You also don't have any fire escapes. No, that these tenement houses aren't built to any code or safety standards. And also the fact that these tenement houses aren't really maintained very much by the landlords didn't help things either. And he also reports that you would have situations where 10 to 15 people could be living in the same room. Just try to count, by the way, how many people are in this picture. And apparently conditions were so bad that fire would break out pretty regularly, like we sort of talked about in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And in fact, and I might be misremembering the story, but at one point there's a fire that breaks out in one of these early tenement houses. That Rees is sort of staying in when he arrives in New York City. When the fire breaks out, he's, obviously kind of scared. He runs out to try to get people to, help him put out the fire. And apparently the police officer that he finds, this is a different police officer, kind of brushes him off and is like, it's not a big deal. And Rees is like, what are you talking about? This tenement house is literally on fire. You should maybe do something. And apparently these fires were pretty commonplace, but apparently the tenement houses were so dingy and filthy that the fires would always get smothered out before they could consume the building. This is kind of the stuff we're talking about during this time period. But when Rees sort of puts this all together, he puts together all of these photographs and all of these excerpts into a work called How the Other Half Lives. And How the Other Half Lives is, again, an example of muckraking journalism. It's something that is designed to create an emotional tie or an emotional appeal to the reader, to the audience. But it's not just a book. In fact, if you go on the course calendar in the video column, you'll see that I have a 10-minute abridged version of one of the lectures that Rees gives, because How the Other Half Lives isn't just a book, it's also meant to be almost like a performance. Rees would go around the country giving lectures, but these are lectures that are probably a little bit better than mine, maybe a lot better than mine, because Rees would bring in musicians, he would bring in dancers, and he would also go through slides of these photographs and talk about them. And so really what you have in The Other Half Lives is not just a book, it's also a show. And it's a show that's intended to be digested by an audience. And this kind of blows my mind that this would be seen as like entertainment. Like instead of going to the Renaissance Festival or the Medieval Times Fair, you would go and catch a show on the plight of urban poverty during this time period. But this is an example of just how effective muckrakers could actually be. I would argue that Jacob Riis is the first muckraker, but also he kind of demonstrates something that, let's say, a darker side to the progressive movement, where in a lot of respects, his sympathies are with the immigrants, but it's also the tone of that sympathy is very patriarchal, paternalistic, kind of similar to what we talked about with Helen Hunt Jackson's How the Other Half Lives, that these immigrants need to be saved because they're helpless and they have no agency. So that's the other side of it, that the compassion that Riis has for immigrants is kind of one-dimensional. So Riis is the first, but he's definitely not the last. Next time, we're going to wade even deeper through the muck. Till next time.